well, we're here with the most prepared man in Palo Alto. That would be Ken Dueker, Director of Office of Emergency Services. Ken, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, and welcome to the Emergency Operations Center.
Thank you. I called you the most prepared man because you have to think about all the possible hazards, threats, disasters that could befall Palo Alto and make sure that the city is ready for it. That is a big responsibility.
Thank you. Yeah, well, you're very generous to say I'm prepared. I think maybe aware of how we need to be prepared as a community would be more salient. We have challenges here in Palo Alto, as all of us who live and work here know. It's a complex, vibrant, diverse community with lots of things going on, and that's the positive. The negative is that all these things, in a way, have their own set of inherent risks, and that's what we're here to explore today.
Yeah, and we have both the residents and we also have the employees. Is it twice the population of Palo Alto that comes in every day, or a substantial number of people?
Our population during the daytime is at least double the census residential population. So you've heard the fire chief kind of describe it as a tale of two cities, which is very accurate. And then we have the wild cards, Stanford football and other special events that can add another maybe triple to the population, with a Stanford football game where the stadium itself holds almost the population of the entire city. Yeah. So that's what we plan for. In short, it's Murphy's Law.
Well, this department and this center didn't even exist 4 years ago. Your position in this either. It's all kind of new. I mean, you've been in the department working these issues for a while, but this office just came online in 2011. Can you tell me a little about the thinking behind breaking out the department and kind of creating the center?
Sure, and just to back up a little bit, so I've been with the police department since the 1990s when I came in roughly 2010 to 2009, the city manager started to look carefully not only at public safety, but of course a lot of other departments, and how we could streamline and rationalize our operations. We being the city manager, hired an outside consultant to assist the city in taking an empirical kind of non-emotional look at a topic that had been brewing for a long time. Certainly the city of Palo Alto had experienced issues with how we could prepare, respond, and recover from major disasters and emergencies, including, of course, the flood of 1998, which is top of mind now. And the blunt reality is that while we have very good operations in the fire department and in the police department, the topic of emergency preparedness was a bit of a hot potato. And it's something that is not well suited to day-to-day public safety operations, because it's tempting to get wrapped around the day-to-day concerns and not think strategically. So in 2011, upon the recommendation of the consultant, the city manager went to the city council and basically advocated that the Office of Emergency Services become its own public safety department with its own chief, or director in my case, and that the mission of our department would be clearly articulated to, again, prepare the community, prepare staff, prepare our key partners. Stanford Hospital work in close collaboration with all of the stakeholders, whether it's residents or nonprofits or faith-based. That's element one. Help with response. Communications is a big deal, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later in the interview. And third, and this is a neglected thing, is to help move the community to the position of resilience, which is the fancy term for being able to take a hit, dust yourself off, and move to recovery, which is the phase that in most cases cities do pretty poorly at, if you look at it bluntly. Right, the Gulf Coast is still in recovery from Hurricane Katrina. Some of these things you could do whatever you want and restructure and have resources, and you're still going to have years and years of recovery. And when, not if, we have the major earthquake, we will be in that unfortunate situation. But by having a dedicated OES, an Office of Emergency Services, we're much better positioned to address those things and allocate appropriate resources. So that's a quick and dirty overview of why we exist as a public safety department. I report to the city manager as one of the directors, along with the police chief and fire chief. And by the way, also Public Works, utilities, all the other city departments. They have a role here in this room. They have a role, obviously, in response. But even if you work, for example, for the library, or you work in accounting, by state law, every city staff member, and by the way, any other government employee, whether you work for a school district, a special district, or another city, is what's known as a disaster service worker. So they all have a role legally to play in recovery. And that's the other role of our office, is to kind of massage that and coordinate
To bring
the
everybody
complexity.
together.
Right.
Yeah, it's safe to say that this is an essential office, but one that we hope we never have to use in a major way, but has to be here.
Right, and that's a good
Prepare.
point. So we are not just the city's insurance policy. We're actually contributing daily. Public education, as I alluded to, is a big mission. That's something that takes an awful lot of staff time. We've given over about 180 presentations to churches, synagogues, business groups, and so forth, just in this calendar year. But we also are highly involved in special event deployment. Some people have seen our Mobile Emergency Operations Center, the MEOC. We had that at Airport Day. That vehicle was used 32 times last year. Everything from real-world emergencies, SWAT callouts, and so forth, but also, thankfully, mainly planned events. So Stanford football games. Every time the President of the United States or other dignitaries come here and they require a command post or a mobile dispatch asset, we deploy. So if we look at that holistically, it means that we're getting practice. We're not just waiting for the earthquake or the flood or whatever bad event might come our way. That would be a failed method. We're getting muscle memory, we're getting practice, and we're also practicing really working with our stakeholders, whether it's the Stanford Hospital or the Red Cross or so forth.
Well, you talked about the creation of the office in the bureaucratic sense, but I want to ask you about the physical office, because
Sure.
this didn't exist also. Before any time, something would happen, like the plane crash in 2010, for example, anything like that, you would get kind of notifications that the EOC has been activated, and I'm kind of always be curious what that means. I'm guessing just a lot of people go to a room that usually doesn't get used.
Sure,
How-
fair enough.
So how has this new office kind of changed the way the city reacts to emergency situations?
Right, so organizational change by itself is academically interesting, but you're getting to logistics, right? So people say that amateurs talk about strategy and professionals talk about logistics, right? That's an old military expression, and it's very true here. So this room was completely gutted and rebuilt soon after I became director, because we realized that having a room with a couple of uncomfortable metal folding chairs and outdated computers and dusty binders in a cabinet was really not a good model. And that was part of why we had a dedicated office as well. So physically and organizationally, so that we'd have accountability to make sure that everything in here works the way it's supposed to. And if you read the after action reports from major events, 9/11 being the most giant one, communications is the thing that really fails. And one of the things we do in here, and we'll talk a little bit later about how we interrelate with the 911 center, but having the ability to communicate even when there's no telephone system or when the internet is impaired is something we could do. And that's not a capability we had before we created this, as well as the Mobile Emergency Operations Center.
Ken, in 2005, in fact, I guess there was a report to the city council about that very issue, right? There was a report that said essentially that communication was one of the biggest things that was lagging in terms of safety and protection and emergency operations. And one of the things that they mentioned was that there was a regional system or a Bay Area system, but that would easily be overloaded in a serious emergency. Can you speak to a little bit how that might have been branched out now?
Sure. And this is a nuanced kind of question, right?
Yeah.
So what that report, in my recollection, after 10 years might be a little off, but I believe it had to do with radio systems for public safety primarily, and you're
right.
thinking of the Baymax mutual aid communication system in particular. The good news is that even though it took more time than anybody would like, and a lot more money than, of course, we would like, and the taxpayers would like, I'm sure, we're on the cusp of deploying the Silicon Valley Regional Communications System, SVRCS, and Google that for more information. But the long and the short of it is it will solve, to a large extent, two key problems. One problem is that you have a diversity, in the negative sense, you have a disparity, I should say, of radio systems. So, for example, Gilroy Police Department is on a VHF radio system. I cannot program in a VHF radio channel into my Palo Alto Police radio because it's a UHF system radio. Yes, they make dual band or multi-band radios that are very expensive. That's besides the point, because the other key issue is that there was limited capacity. We didn't have a lot of extra channels, especially for the fancy word is radio interoperability, meaning If Gilroy Police comes up here to assist Palo Alto, or we send a fire strike team down to assist Morgan Hill, for example, they may or may not be able to communicate. And by having a unified system, in this case a digital system, a lot of those things are ameliorated because you have more capacity, you have more interoperability channels, and more flexibility. That said, a lot of the analog channels are going to live on because we need to have interoperability not only in our region but throughout the state, in fact throughout the country. So we'll have the best of both worlds when the system comes up. City of Santa Clara and Sunnyvale are already on the system. They will be using it for Super Bowl, February 7th, 2016, Super Bowl 50 for those who are not following that. And that'll be a good test, but the complete rollout of the system really won't happen until much later, which is acceptable. We have other mutual aid and interoperability systems that are coming online.
Are you talking about next year, later next year, or just after?
It'll probably be well after that, just because of the complexity. They've got to basically install an entire new repeater system. There was a new box just put on the roof here of City Hall that is one of the cells for that. Think of it like a cell phone
Sure. Yeah.
expansion.
So you also mentioned Super Bowl. So it seems like this winter we may have a confluence of a number of major concerns that we may or may not have to deal with. One is the Super Bowl, the second is El Nino, and the third is any potential terrorist threats. So how
Maybe we should unpack those
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to get to the terrorism
Okay.
topic, which is pretty much on people's
Sure.
minds. There's a poll that just showed that 60% of Americans are concerned about a terrorism act likely to happen on U.S. soil. So I'm wondering, what is the role of the Palo Alto OES in terms of interfacing with any kind of intelligence agencies, or how are we in the middle of dealing with terrorism possibilities and preparing for that?
Good, so I'll have to unpack that question too,
Okay.
because even that is highly loaded with lots of good stuff. So the role of the Office of Emergency Services is to deal with all hazards, and all hazards in the FEMA definition is natural disasters, which is the thing we think about generally most, earthquakes and floods. But we also deal with accidents. The small plane that took off from the airport in February of 2010 and tragically hit the power line and knocked out power. That's not terrorism. It's not a natural disaster. It's a human accident. And then the final one is this human-caused crime, and terrorism primarily is what falls into that category. And because of recent events, not only in San Bernardino, but globally, of course, Paris being the other one, it's natural that people have a fear, for lack of a better term. There's an anxiety that grows, I think because of two factors. One, that particular kind of threat is something that is not understandable readily for most people. So because we don't comprehend it too well, most people, you're going to attach more weight to it. And the other one, sorry you're in the media, but the media, obviously if it bleeds, it leads. So they're pumping these stories and they're showing, unfortunately, really the most graphic bits. And that leads also to people, in my view, disproportionately attaching a threat or a perceived risk to an event that if you look at it calmly without emotion, you're going to say, well, the risk is still pretty low. That said, we are plugged into the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, the FBI. We meet regularly with not just the police and law enforcement side, but all the other disciplines who are highly involved. A terrorist event like that is as much an emergency medical system response, right? It's a mass casualty in the beginning as it is a law enforcement event. Now, ultimately, it's a law enforcement event because they're going to investigate it. But all disciplines in public safety have a big role in terrorism preparation, counterterrorism, and response. So that's a quick way to look at that. The role of the Emergency Operations Center, were we to have an event, whether it's a major crime, active shooter, school violence, heaven forbid, this is obviously just like we would in an earthquake or a flood, where we're going to do our key mission.
So in very basic terms, and so all the different heads of the fire, police, you would come here and be working the situation
Correct.
together?
Staffing might be a little different depending on the nature. For example, a flood is primarily a public works and somewhat a utilities and somewhat a public safety event, but the police department doesn't have bulldozers, right? That's up to the public works department. Whereas, heaven forbid, we have a school shooting or something like that, it's going to be primarily law. But the idea of the EOC is to not exclude resources. We want everybody to play a role that's logical and makes sense. We don't need to put everybody in the room who doesn't need to be here, but we need every resource we can get. That's going to be a big damaging thing to our entire community. And remember, we want, as soon as we can, the scene is stabilized. We want to move to recovery and healing, if you will, after such an event.
Yeah, and to your point about the media, I think we all fully acknowledge the responsibility that the media plays in communicating during disasters, after disasters, not creating unnecessary fear and what have you, and being a partner to the responders as well.
I want to ask about a different disaster real quick. Last year, this office, in conjunction with other departments, released a threat assessment report, which basically analyzed one of those "what could possibly go wrong" documents, and it kind of ranked the various things that could happen by likelihood and concern to residents. And number one, by a lot, was earthquake damage. Given that this is at City Hall, and we've been hearing for decades about how seismically unsafe it is, and this is such a critical new facility, I'm just curious: is this place safe?
I would say it is to a limited extent, but it's not. It is not up to the California Critical Facility Standards, which is why we have this initiative to build a new public safety headquarters. And if you lose the ability to dispatch units and to take calls, remember the wall behind us is the 911 center. And for those who are not familiar, we have the third busiest 911 center in the county. We're dispatching police, fire, Stanford Department of Public Safety, the university's police department, as well as certain public works and utilities and even animal services functions for multiple cities out of that little operation there next door. So to answer your question, it is safe up to a point, but it's not rated to take the kind of seismic event that the U.S. Geological Survey says that we likely will experience sometime in the next 30 years. So there is a good push, and I think it's very rational, to invest money in infrastructure so that we can mitigate this risk. That said, one reason we have the Mobile Emergency Operations Center is to provide a backup. Now, if people are injured or, heaven forbid, killed, that's obviously a problem. We can have all the equipment we want. If we don't have the key people we need to do the job, we're in trouble. And a lot of our employees, of course, live far away. So the other complexity, especially with earthquakes, is if the bridges across the bay are down or other overpasses are down, we have a very bad situation in this city. We will deal with whoever is on duty and the few of us, like myself, who live in town or nearby. And that will be a bad day. It will be a bad week. It'll be a bad month.
That's I think that's an oft heard truism that there's only so much that city personnel can get to in a disaster, and that there's going to be a real need of the populace to be assisting each other, assisting themselves. What's the kind of level of expectation that you, as a professional, kind of want to set for the residents of Palo Alto?
That's a very solid question. One of the issues in the past, and this was kind of a cultural thing, especially in public safety, was it's kind of a macho thing. Right? We don't want to admit that we have any weaknesses. As we become a little more enlightened, we realize that it does the public no good to pretend that we have infinite public safety resources or public works, or at a certain point, we run out of people, we run out of resources, we can no longer even answer the calls that might come in. And unfortunately, we've come to the point now where we're, as I said before, a little bit leaning more on the ultra transparency side. I would rather people come away from hearing a lecture or a presentation going, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how few public works employees are on duty at Sunday at 2 a.m. Because if we don't do that, people have this false expectation. You're used to calling 911 day to day, and you would expect an ambulance and a police car or whatever you need within 5 or 10 minutes.
Just sit there, someone's going to come.
Right, just sit there. And that works day to day, but it's not scalable. And that's the critical thing, is that when we have major flooding, an earthquake, a major crime or terror event, again, when, not if, all that stops. And if your family plan involves reaching for your cell phone and dialing 911, then you need a different family plan.
How much help can we expect from the citizens who have been prepared, whether that's the medical corps, you have ham radio operators, you've got block neighborhood captains?
Correct. Yeah, so the block preparedness coordinators and the neighborhood coordinators, those are all part of this somewhat new structure as well. When we restructured OES, to your prior point, the big push was to make sure that we engaged all the great community resources. We're very fortunate in Palo Alto to have a disproportionately high number, for example, of medical professionals, retired doctors, nurses, and so forth. And we didn't have any system in place to say, well, great, you're a retired nurse, what can you do? You're a retired doctor, you're a retired doctor. We didn't have a system in place, and yet there is a federal system called the Medical Reserve Corps. So that's one module. We have other people with communications expertise, the so-called ham radio operators. And we have the block preparedness coordinators, which was an evolution from what used to be Neighborhood Watch. So they have a day-to-day crime prevention role. So putting them all together in this structure, the Emergency Services Volunteer ESV program, allowed us to get a handle, if you will, on what resources are in the community, how they would help each other. We have written protocols on our city webpage. People want to look, cityofpalto.org/emergency volunteers with an S. So take a look, and if you have any interest, those of you in the public, come volunteer. It's not a big time commitment in most cases, but our goal is to have, for example, every residential neighborhood to have a neighborhood preparedness coordinator. They're issued a special radio by us. So even in a massive power outage or a cyber attack and your iPhone is now an expensive paperweight, we can still communicate, coordinate with them, and more importantly, the neighbors now among neighborhoods can share resources and solve problems at the lowest possible level, which is really, I think, the most compelling part of the program.
How many people are there in this program?
I don't have the exact numbers. It's in the 600 range, maybe a little bit more right now. Some people become inactive, and we kind of float them through. The other thing that was a goal is, a lot of our population is aging, of course, and yet just because somebody is more elderly doesn't mean they can't help. So maybe you can't drag somebody out of a collapsed building and perform CPR anymore because you're not physically able, but maybe instead you could be at a logistics trailer at one of our fire stations and help check out equipment or operate a radio. So there are other roles, and we allow people to morph in there, but it's a few hundred people who are actively involved, and we really appreciate their help.
Okay. I don't want to lose sight of the question that Sue had about storm preparedness and how residents could get ready this winter for El Nino.
So I'll refer to another webpage, of course. So the cityofpalto.org/storms with an S has a lot of helpful information, but there are three basic things, and this applies to storms as much as many other hazards. First one is having a family plan and being ready to deal with really things that might come at very short notice. And I'll come back to how short the notice might be. Be ready to evacuate, whether you're told to evacuate or not. The other one is staying informed. Obviously, the media would support that, I would imagine, but there are a lot of ways to get good information. Most of them are web and cell driven. But remember, if we lose, for whatever reason, cell phones and the internet, you can listen to 90.1 FM when you're not listening to city council meetings and fun music on that channel, 90.1 FM. We can take that over here from the building and tell you useful things, such as, hey, Stanford Hospital is closed, or there's flooding under the Embarcadero underpass, avoid the area. And that is great, as long as people know to listen to it. But again, back to expectations, we won't be able to do that in the first few hours realistically. Our staff will be very busy. So make some sort of family plan, including ready to evacuate, stay informed. And the final one is it's kind of a combo in the case of storms. So you want to have supplies and tools. So people are right now, of course, getting sandbags, which is good for some, but not all residences. Sandbags are not a panacea. You want to have the ability, for example, to rake the leaves off your storm drains. If you don't have a rake handy, time to get one. You might coordinate with your neighbors. With the trees the way they are now, not all the leaves are off by any stretch.
Yeah.
So it might be at 2 a.m. somebody needs to go out and clear your storm drain. I'd rather neighbors do that themselves than call us and expect somebody to come. Again, realistic expectations. So those are the three key
I
elements.
still want to ask about the city's role. There's that famous Paul Romer quote, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." And you were here in the late 90s, 1998, when there was the huge flood. I kind of wanted to get your assessment about the city's preparation for that flood and whether there were any lessons learned, what the city would do differently this time around.
Sure. I was in the police academy during the flood, so I can't speak directly to that, but I was certainly there here on duty soon thereafter, and I remember some of the big things about what the city could have done. There's always the so-called armchair quarterbacking. The city's learned a lot of good lessons from that event, and for those who are not clear, It was February 3rd and 4th of 1998, back 17 years ago almost. And the National Weather Service predicts that the current El Nino pattern that we're looking at, as of right now, looks unfortunately really similar to that. And so, to your point, Sue, it lines up with the week of Super Bowl
Right.
rather unpleasantly.
Right.
So, our level of preparation is driven by an assumption that we'll have at least as bad as a 1998 level event sometime in the late January, early February timeframe. So there's been a lot of work at the department level. Public Works has brought in extra sandbags, extra crews. We've even hired contractors, so people who can bring in heavy equipment that the city doesn't have, or we don't have personnel adequate at certain times of day or on the weekend.
Were these actions not taken in '98? Is this kind of a new thing?
Some of
We're
them,
hoping to get to the armchair quarterbacking.
yeah, sure. I think some of them were thought about then, but they really weren't implemented. It's unfortunately human nature, right? Time goes by and there are other priorities. But no, I mean, this is the year that we are doing the full court press, to continue a sports analogy, to make sure we're prepared. And a lot of that too is not just the city of Palo Alto. We've done a lot of work with our neighboring communities, East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, both counties, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, because we could succeed in Palo Alto, and yet it would still be a failure if bad things happen to our neighboring cities. So the cities have come together. We're in the process of formalizing, it's a fancy term, and it's a mouthful, the San Francisco Creek, which we call SFC for short, Multi-Agency Coordination, MAC. So SFC MAC is what we're looking at, and it has some components that allow us to more easily share resources, to assist if, heaven forbid, there's flooding in Menlo Park. We can help and cross the county line, but there are a lot of legal and structural impediments that we'd rather address a priori. So that's part of it. And the other bit, especially salient for you, is to make sure that all the public information officers are also synchronized as best we can, because we don't want any ambiguity, especially when it comes to where damage is, where evacuations might need to be conducted, and so forth. So I'm simplifying that in the interest of time, but there's a lot of recent activity. Absolutely fair to say some of that should have happened years ago.
Well, we could dedicate a whole episode to the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority flood control plan.
Yeah, and the Joint Powers Authority is a separate animal. They are, of course, a planning entity that deals with mitigation. They're not a response agency.
But their big project, though, would have big implications if there's a huge flood.
It would make my life easier if we could fix some of that, that's for sure.
Well, there's any number of topics that we could continue to talk about. I wanted to wrap it up in the interests of time and the fact that you're going to take us on a little tour here in the EOC. Was there anything that you wanted to touch upon that we haven't in this interview before we sign off?
Well, I appreciate the interest in this. My message to the general public, and it's a tough one because people are all busy and we all have our lives to lead, is that people, whether you're an individual or a family or even a block or a neighborhood, really need to have some personal responsibility to be prepared. And it's unfortunate that we have to discuss terrorism and shootings and in the same breath as flooding and earthquake. But the good news in all this is that if you get prepared, you'll be much better able to withstand some calamity, whatever it is, and come through it, not unscathed, but you'll come through it and you'll be able to get back to running your family, running your life, going back to work. And in the final analysis, that's what's most important. That's what survival is all about. Thank you.
Well, Ken Dueker, thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines this week. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
We stay tuned if you want to see a tour of the EOC. Gennady Sheyner will have a little interview with Ken, and you can always catch us on PaloAltoOnline.com.